This podcast contains discussions on sexual misconduct. Topics such as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment may be discussed. Listener discretion is advised, and we encourage self-care and seeking professional support as needed.
In the international aid system, unless you speak English or at least another former colonial language or another of the UN languages, you're not required to be able to communicate with the people that are directly affected. This whole worldview, there's a little bubble, essentially. And we've not been good traditionally at recognizing that the places affected by and the people affected by emergencies are often massively linguistically diverse. I mean, Nigeria, 500 languages. DRC, 200 languages.
In this episode, I speak to Ellie Kemp, Strategic Partnerships Director and previous Head of Research at Clear Global, a non-profit organization who help people get vital information and be heard whatever language they speak. Ellie demonstrates through research how language can be one of the biggest barrier or lever to prevention and response to sexual misconduct in the aid sector.
What's the point my attempting to report him? He speaks French. Who's going to listen to me? And it comes back to that power. If you speak French, you speak the language of the system. You know what words to use in order to make your case.
This is the #NoExcuse podcast. We discuss the challenges, complexities, and potential solution in preventing and responding to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the humanitarian and development sectors. You'll hear interviews with victims and survivors, experts, aid workers, artists, and leaders. The podcast is produced by the World Health Organization's Department for the Prevention and Response to Sexual Misconduct. I am Guni Dias, your host and Global PRS Network Coordinator for the department. Ellie Kemp, welcome to the #NoExcuse podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So you started your professional career as a translator.
That's right. Many moons ago.
But you didn't stop there. You have an amazing experience in the humanitarian and aid sector with expertise in communication and advocacy globally, and worked in countries like DRC, Kenya, Somalia, Sierra Leone. And because of your background, you have a unique take on and perspective on language. In the spirit of better understanding this complex operating landscape, which is the humanitarian aid sector, could you tell us more about the power dynamics that language can play between an aid worker and the communities they serve?
Well, I mean, language is tied up with power in any society. How you speak and the language that you speak tells something about how educated you are and whether you belong to a certain group, etc. And the aid system really amplifies that because it is massively Anglo-centric. If you think about all of the professional standards, all of the visions and strategies and, conceptual documents and principles and all the rest of it that's ever been developed for the global international humanitarian system, they've been developed in English. They reflect a certain worldview of native English speakers from the global north and others who've been educated as second language English speakers. So that the whole worldview is then dumped on the communities that are affected by emergencies. The sphere standard's now being translated into dozens of different languages, but it is that worldview and that concept that's then translated and goes out. International aid workers, particularly, they need to be able to speak English. You can't really get on very far in the international aid system unless you speak English or at least another former colonial language or another of the UN languages. You're not required to be able to communicate with the people that are directly affected. This whole worldview, there's a little bubble, essentially. And we've not been good traditionally at recognizing that the places affected by and the people affected by emergencies are often massively linguistically diverse. I mean, Nigeria, 500 languages. DRC, 200 languages. This is a very linguistically diverse context. But we go in without attention often to that diversity and without data on that diversity. And so there's not an expectation on the people that are attempting to support affected communities, whether they come from outside that country or their national staff. There's not that expectation often that they will need to be able to communicate and listen, importantly, in a whole range of languages. So the language reinforces power structure. So within DRC, for instance, you learn to speak French at school. You learn to speak really good French at university. If you speak really good French, you are already from quite an elite represented section of society. The people who are most affected by emergencies and have fewer resources are often people that don't speak those powerful languages, because speaking a powerful language is already kind of a marker of a degree of resilience, and it's gendered. So there's one really important thing to understand is that if your first language isn't, say, French or Swahili in Eastern Congo or Hausa in Northeast Nigeria, then you'll learn that at school. And so it's the people that don't go to school or don't get very much schooling who are typically excluded when humanitarians don't bother speaking or aren't aware that they need to speak in their own languages. And the people that, around the world that don't get very much schooling, it's women and girls. It's people with disabilities of various kinds. It's often the older generation. It's particularly marginalised, and clans and castes and tribes and so on. When humanitarians are not aware of and not paying attention to the communication needs and the languages of affected people, they're sending a message basically about, unintentionally for the most part, about who's important here, who this aid is for, who we're listening to. And we can increase people's vulnerability as a result. If you can only give feedback or report abuse, for instance, or you feel you can only do so in a more powerful language, and that's not your language, then you're not heard, then you're silenced, and other people will also know that other people will know that you can only access assistance or access reporting mechanisms with help from somebody else. The Anglo-centricism and the kind of language blindness, which has been a feature of international humanitarian assistance, just adds an extra layer on top of people's potential vulnerability and the silencing that already happens to certain sections of every society. And of course, when there's an emergency, the stakes are higher. What people need it's very much more urgent that people should have access to the support and the information. It's a piece that we really need to understand and we really need to do more about.
You explained basically that language is such an important component to provide aid to communities that are vulnerable and who require that aid. And if we can't provide that aid in a communication or in language that they can receive, then it feels that what we're doing, it's like a missed target.
Absolutely.
When it comes to the prevention and response to sexual misconduct, could you share data and insights on the key challenges when it comes to language and communication?
So the number of different levels.
Mm-hmm.
There's that piece about accountability. So there was a great study done by UNICEF's CAS team a few years ago in Western DRC, where they spoke to women who were affected by sexual exploitation and abuse. And there's a brilliant quote, which I'm going to have to paraphrase because I don't have it exactly, but one woman said, "What's the point my attempting to report him? He speaks French. Who's going to listen to me?" Mm. And it comes back to that power. If you speak French, you speak the language of the system. You know what words to use in order to make your case and say how it wasn't your fault, or, you're not really to blame, or this woman is just inventing something. The woman felt that and I'm sure she wasn't alone, she couldn't say anything that was going to be heard against that because she wasn't able to communicate in that language. So that's one piece of it. There's issues also around how challenging it is to communicate about some of the key concepts. Part of this is our humanitarian jargon. So we talk about, I think sexual misconduct isn't a bad version. The prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment is a whole set of different terms, and often quite difficult terms. And when we have done comprehension testing, often people don't see the difference between them. There are definitions behind them, which mean that, within the international system, we may understand the distinction and see them as important. But when we did testing, for instance, in places like Iraq, people didn't see those distinctions as relevant. This kind of internationally agreed terminology often isn't isn't clear to others, it often doesn't translate very well into other languages. Some of the words related to abuse, like rape, for instance, in the Rohingya language, research found they only relate to something that a man does to a woman. It couldn't be used for male rape, for instance. And the Women's Refugee Commission did some great research with the Rohingya refugee community a few years ago, where they found out that if they wanted to talk to men and boys about sexual abuse, sexual violence, they had to use terms that related to torture, because that then made sense. So finding the words that make sense, and rather than insisting on our own distinctions and our own definitions, I think is important. Mm-hmm. It can also be confusing. So when we tested exploitation, the word exploitation in Haiti, people associated it with colonialism and with more economic exploitation. Right. So there isn't just one, our concepts don't mean the same thing to everybody. So we shouldn't go out there insisting on them. But then understanding when people are trying to speak to us about is of sexual misconduct and what words and concepts make sense to them is really important. So torture, for instance, in the case of Rohingya men and boys, where we did a lot of research on sociolinguistics, people use euphemisms, and Rohingya women and girls were talking about staining and dishonor when they meant various forms of sexual violence or gender-based violence. But they couldn't use those terms. So understanding that is important. And then the way in which we communicate, we actually need to make sure that it is both acceptable, so people are happy to engage in a conversation, and it's understood. So we did some comprehension testing around posters that were being used in Eastern DRC a few years back. And people simply didn't understand that this picture was meant to represent some kind of sexual exploitation and abuse. In other cases, the ways in which it was represented were stigmatizing, particularly of women who were engaged in transactional sex. There were issues about inclusive communication, communication that recognizes that adult women, for instance, are not the only people who may be affected by sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and making it possible for, in a same-sex context, to speak up, to get support if support is what they want. We found that reporting systems often, this was in this research in DRC, were not set up for local languages. So we mapped, I think, 11 different hotlines that were set up, including for reports of sexual misconduct. And of them, only 4 went beyond French. And those were only in 4 national languages. Whereas in Eastern Congo, you're looking at dozens of languages. And the people who aren't going to be able to communicate confidently, particularly on something really sensitive in another language, and maybe precisely the people that are more vulnerable, have fewer choices, and therefore are more vulnerable to exploitation. And then I think there is 2 other really big things. I think one is talking about what is relevant. We saw again in Eastern DRC, that a lot of the communication was about finger wagging. It was seen as moralizing. It was like, these are things that you must not do. Women, community members and survivors said to us, you think I have a choice? This is the best option that I have. Or if I had that option, I would definitely take it, because this is a way of putting food on the table for my children. This is an economic necessity. So don't moralize to me about this is prohibited behavior, and certainly don't, present me in a cheap way that causes other people to say, well, this is sinful behavior, because that really doesn't help me. Here are the things that I need. I need financial independence. I also need to know, if I did find it that I wanted to report abuse, for instance, because it's got violent, or because I'm scared, or because promises are broken, I want to know, are you going to keep me safe? What am I likely to get out of that? Will the potential benefits, kind of support that I can get, outweigh the risks for me of reporting? How do I know you're going to keep me confidential? Those real questions people weren't answered. Instead, they saw finger wagging from these big organizations. So we need to talk about what's relevant for people, and not just communicate the things that we kind of performatively show that we are taking this issue seriously. And in that research, we saw that IDP sites just plastered with different posters from different organizations. You can just imagine the budget that went onto that. How much of that might have gone more effectively into, livelihood support for women and others who might be at risk. And then I think there's a really critical piece around changing organizational cultures. And we were both present at a really interesting meeting where that was talked about the other week in Geneva. I think changing organizational culture requires people in powerful positions to listen to those who are not in powerful positions. You know, the office cleaner, the driver, the warehouse worker needs to be able to have a conversation, a transparent conversation about the power dynamics and what is acceptable and what isn't, and what people are comfortable with and what they're not. And those conversations they have to happen in a language or in multiple languages. So that's something we have to figure out so that, the speaker of the very powerful language can genuinely hear what it means for speakers of less powerful languages. Part of that is within organizations agreeing on what is acceptable behavior and what are the acceptable words to use to talk about it, so that everybody feels comfortable to speak in some way and everybody actually gets to be heard. And I think that changing that is a sector-wide culture, needs some awareness of how the power dynamics are reinforced by the way in which we use language or the attention that we pay to language.
Can you share examples of successful initiatives or projects that you've led or that you've participated where this piece of language really enabled impact?
I think there's a few. It's not always directly related to sexual misconduct or preventing sexual misconduct, but I think we can learn from what is done in other areas of our work as well. In terms of listening, and I think that's a really critical piece that we haven't cracked yet in terms of sexual misconduct. A really interesting initiative that we did with IOM in northeast Nigeria a few years ago. IOM set up these kind of listening stations. So until then, feedback mechanisms were either the trusted suggestion box, where you have to be able to write, which isn't everybody's case in northeast Nigeria, particularly women's, and you have to be able to write in Hausa because that's the language that the organization is able to deal with feedback in. So there was that, or there were also feedback desks, which were staffed by humans, generally Hausa speakers, generally Hausa speaking men. So as an alternative to that, recognizing that it was an issue, IOM set up these little booths. I mean, it was half of a container, and they bolted a recording device to the wall, and you could go in, shut the door so you're in privacy, and press record, and you could say whatever you wanted in whatever language you wanted. And it would then be uploaded, and the Clear Global team in Maiduguri would figure out what language it was. Sometimes it was multiple languages, translate it into English and relay it back to IOM to share with partners so that they could address the feedback. And what they found was that suddenly lots of languages were being used. People actually wanted to use much more than Hausa. And that particularly women were giving feedback and reporting issues in other languages. When we went back even last year and asked people, okay, so what has been effective in terms of accountability and feedback mechanisms, people spontaneously spoke about that initiative. It's using voice. People don't have to be able to write. It's set up to offer privacy. It's local to where people are, and they can use whatever language they want to. That kind of mechanism can be useful. There's also, we developed with others a PSEA glossary. A lot of the terminology in it, more than 50 languages, I think, at this point. The translations have been tested with communities in the different languages. And there are some great examples of how when you take a translation to a community and say, okay, well, this is what we mean by it. What does it mean to you? They can give you a much better, much clearer, much more kind of grounded translation. My favorite example of this, I think, is in Chichewa. One of the terms in the glossary was about negative coping mechanisms, which is very humanitarian jargon. But it's so broad, it's so abstract. It didn't mean anything to people. So we explained what it was meant to mean. And they said, okay, well, how about, they gave a translation in Chewa, which literally translates back into English as a way of dealing with problems that creates more problems. Bingo. It makes sense. It's clear to everybody. It's clear to somebody with a PhD. It's clear to somebody who's never been to school. Research and testing and so on can be really powerful in terms of understanding how to communicate, what people really understand. Last year, I think with World Vision, looking at communication materials on sexual misconduct for children, obviously really tricky, but children aged between like 3 and 17, looking at what they actually understand from the materials that are already there. Obviously, it's important not to scare children either. So finding sensitive, appropriate ways to discuss things that could put children at risk and the ways in which, what they can do if they don't feel comfortable, for instance. And what we found was that existing materials were often not understood. So just assuming that everyone's going to understand something in the way in which it was intended clearly doesn't work. So that's on the listening side. On the communicating side, we did a nice piece developed a tip sheet together with Oxfam a few years ago on communicating and working with interpreters on sensitive topics, which goes very much to the kinds of examples that I've been describing, but understanding how people need to talk about sensitive topics in a different way and ways to approach that. So I think there are pieces of the puzzle. I think we have a lot still to do, but there are pieces that are there and there are things that we can already learn from.
They are amazing and significant pieces because basically you're telling to very intellectual and people that you just have to keep it simple and you don't have to over intellectualize a topic or a messaging that just needs to be simple and speak to people.
Totally. I've worked a lot in protection in the past and there's a lot of very kind of legal heavy jargon in the protection field in the humanitarian sector because to lawyers it's all really important. Those definitions are really important, but they're only relevant if everybody engaged in the conversation understands them. Mm-hmm. And if you're actually your end goal is to help somebody be safer, then you actually want to listen. You actually need to know what she feels is important and what's happening to her and understand the words that she's using to do that.
We definitely have pieces of the puzzle thanks to some of those research you've mentioned. And how do you envision the landscape evolving in the next few years? Are you excited by the rise of AI?
I think there's a lot of good potential in AI, particularly language AI. Clear Global works on language, so you would expect that to be the piece that I'm particularly interested in. At the moment, it's only, when I say language AI, I mean like machine translation and automated speech recognition, that kind of thing. It's only available with any quality in a really narrow range of languages. And not mostly the languages of people, well, not mainly, mostly there's about 7,000 languages in the world. Most of them are not served.
Right.
And particularly the languages of marginalised communities that are particularly affected by emergencies of various kinds. A lot of those languages aren't online or they have very, very little data online. So, something like ChatGPT works fantastically for English because most of the internet is in English. But if you speak a language like Mandara, there isn't anything online for Mandara or scarcely anything. And so you don't have the language data, which is the raw material to build language technology. But I think that there is huge potential there because the humanitarian sector, the international development sector, the social impact sector generally is increasingly digitalizing. And that means that it is having conversations with speakers of marginalized languages. And that means we're generating data. We're generating the raw material for language technology in a much wider range of languages than the commercial tech development sector is currently interested in. So I think there is real potential. Ultimately, what you want, the vision is for a Mandara speaking disabled older woman in northeast Nigeria not to have to rely on somebody else to give her information about what her rights are, or to be able to report abuse. You want her to be able to speak into her device and engage directly with, a hotline. She speaks in Mandara and it's understood in the other language and that then works and she can then hold people to account on that basis. That's the holy grail. That would be fantastic for her. That would have a real impact on her agency, on her ability to take actions and get the information that she wants for herself without becoming more reliant on others and therefore more vulnerable. So I think that's huge potential. And there's a real call to action to the sector to help develop that. But otherwise, in terms of what's ahead, I think we have an awful lot of work to do. And that piece around prevention is something that I really hope we get to make real headway on. I think it's not good enough. I'm infuriated by the resources that go into pasting, posters from 15 different organizations all over the walls of an IDP camp. That's completely insane. Let us, as a sector, look at what's actually happening. People are not intentionally, for the most part, saying, I know, let's waste our resources. But we've set it up as a sector so that there's a budget for this and it must be spent. Well, let's take that money and look at how it could be used more effectively. And if women in Eastern DRC are saying, for instance, we need financial independence, so we have choices, then let's see what's possible on that. And I see that some organizations, recently IRC, were communicating about the fact that they are specifically investing in livelihood support for women in Eastern DRC precisely as a safeguard against sexual exploitation and abuse. We would also do well to look at language as a factor much more consciously across all of the systems that we set up around sexual misconduct, including, for instance, capturing which languages it's possible to report in, which languages are taken on board in the referral of people who do report, and how that affects the trust that people have, people's willingness to report. So I think there's, on all parts of the equation, I think there is a language power dynamic that we could really learn from and that could help us to be more effective in both prevention and response.
Thank you for sharing your vision. You brilliantly showed us the power of language and how language is a key lever to achieve this change and impact. And your work really helps us understand even better where there's still gaps and where we have to start changing. So thank you for sharing and taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you, Goon, very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the World Health Organization's #NoExcuse podcast. We hope we've given you another perspective on preventing and responding to sexual misconduct in the humanitarian and development sectors. We release new episodes every 2 weeks. But if you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions in the meantime, feel free to reach out at prseah@who.int. Until the next time, goodbye.